Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing on with the life of Joseph. And he has given his recommendation to Pharaoh about the not just the interpretation of the dreams, but what should happen next. A game plan, basically, to how to cope against the upcoming 7 years of plenty and then the 7 years of famine. And so, with that, now how does Pharaoh respond? And how he responds, but more how he describes Joseph is really interesting and I think is really encouraging for us as believers. So turn back with me to Genesis chapter 41. We're going to go to verse 37. We're going to be looking at verses 37 through 49 today. So with that, verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Good start. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" I think that right there, verse 38, is the most powerful up till when Joseph reunites with his brothers. This is the most powerful part to me of the life of Joseph is verse 38 describing Joseph as a man in whom is the Spirit of God. And maybe not every single text, but a lot of versions will have spirit here capitalized. And the reason that you do that is to make the connection between with the Holy Spirit. And so we're talking about the third person of the Godhead, the Holy Spirit, indwelling Joseph. Well, this is centuries before the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit comes to indwell the disciples. And so it's really quite fascinating that we see that here. We see this in the Old Testament too. It's not just the New Testament that we see the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, but I find that really fascinating that we see that in the life of Joseph, that he is described as a man in whom is the Spirit of God. And how as believers, how can we show that we are men and women in whom is the Spirit of God? By obviously, yes, by the things that we say, but the fact that we are so in tune with with the Lord that we are not only speaking on behalf of Him, but that we are following that up with our actions. And I think for me, it's not just Pharaoh's not just looking at this plan that is being presented by the words that it's saying, but the fact that it is being presented by a man that was wrongfully taken from his home, sold into slavery, that was put under a stranger, blessed that stranger with his work ethic and his character, was then, well, I guess defamed is the right word, but was wrongfully accused of a crime that he didn't commit by his former master's wife, put into prison for 2 years, and yet still showed incredible character. I think that is where you get this statement from Pharaoh, this question from Pharaoh. How can we find this man if it's not Joseph? And so I think for me as a believer and for you as a believer, our goal is to strive to be more and more like Jesus. Yes, we will not be perfect, uh, but it's strive to be more and more like Jesus, where somebody says, can we find a man or woman like this in whom is the Spirit of God outside of you? Because you are you are striving to be so much like Jesus. It would be hard for us to find somebody else that is on that same level. Again, not that we're perfect, but we're trying and striving to be more and more like Jesus. I think that's really interesting to see in verse 38. So we've already covered 2 verses, and yet it's something that I want to take time on. Verse 38, I think, is incredibly powerful, not just in this section, but in the whole entire life of Joseph. And it can be so encouraging and so powerful for us as followers of Jesus today. So let's head back. Verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." So he is making the connection that not only is Joseph wise and discerning, but he knows that God has shown him these things. And for us as believers, yes, we can be wise and yes, we can be discerning, but the thing that separates us is the fact that we love and we follow and we serve Jesus Christ. That's what separates us from others. So I think that's a really interesting point to see. Verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt," which is culminating the dreams that Joseph had at the very beginning when we are introduced to him, when he is telling his brothers and his father the dreams that he is having. Now it's all coming together. Now, granted, the brothers haven't come yet. Uh, his dad hasn't come to Egypt yet, so it hasn't completely been fulfilled yet. But it's on the way there, and so you see that, and I think that's really interesting. The other thing I think is interesting too. There's 3 separate discussions or declarations here. So first, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? The second one, the wisdom and discernment of Joseph, and then the fact that he wants him over his house, but he's not, but he's second in command of the whole entire country, or of his house. But then the third statement is that he is over all the land of Egypt, outside of Pharaoh, of course, is the number one, but Joseph is the number 2 over all the land of Egypt. I think that's really interesting. Those 3 separate conversations or declarations, probably is a better word. The 3 declarations that Pharaoh says to Joseph. I think that's definitely not a coincidence, and I think that's really interesting to see. Verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. So he basically gives these things, the signet ring, the garments of fine linen, gold chain, putting him in his second chariot, is to show that he is completely on board with the plan that he has just put into place, being Pharaoh. Pharaoh is completely on board with what is about to happen. And yeah, again, just the fulfillment of these dreams that Joseph had as a young man, as a boy, is coming together. And that's really, really interesting to see. Verse 44. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." So we have a fourth declaration. He says, "Look, yes, I am in charge, but uh, there is nothing could go on without your knowledge and without your wisdom into that situation." So you have these 4 statements just growing the authority and the character of Joseph here. Just really fascinating stuff. But then he gives him a new name, which is interesting. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Um, it is interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on Thursday. But it is interesting that Joseph takes the daughter of a priest of a foreign god, of a pagan god. Is this then wrong of Joseph to do? First off, it does seem to be an arranged marriage. It is not Joseph's choice that he marries Asenath. It does look like Pharaoh is the one that puts this together. So, but I wonder in the back of my mind if Asenath comes to know and follow Jehovah at some point. That's interesting because with the character of Joseph, you would think that and his faith would rub off on his wife at some point. We never really know, and so it's something interesting to kind of think about in the back of the mind. But now let's see a little bit more here about Joseph as he gets going with this plan. Verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went through all the land of Egypt. So he's only 30 years old, which is quite striking because it seems like we've known him for a while. But it's really cool to see how God uses a young person to do just these impossible and kind of crazy things. Now, in this day and age, 30 was not looked at as incredibly young. It was kind of like middle age almost. But still, it's fascinating to see how far Joseph has come and that his 28th and 29th years were spent in prison. But now he's the second in command in Egypt. Just pretty crazy stuff, right? So, verse 47 during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. So Joseph puts together this plan that he is going to just start using the cities as kind of like storehouses for this abundance of grain. And yes, it gets to a point where it cannot be measured, but I'm so glad it did because the famine itself will be of such destruction that it cannot be measured either. And so it's interesting to see that. But then, too, so Joseph at the end of these 7 and 7 years. So he'll be about 44 years old. So really in the prime of his life, he is working this plan. And yes, it makes sense. Like 7 years, yeah, that should be plenty of time to bring in a really really good harvest, right? But then you have to think that's followed immediately by 7 years of nothing, no harvest at all. And that's where we're about to turn to on Thursday as we end chapter 41 and see how does Joseph go about when it comes to the beginning of the 7 years of famine and really just kind of destruction. So we will see that on Thursday. So I will see you then. Thanks.